Have you ever stopped to ask yourself why a woman might choose to live alone, not because she has no options, but because none of them feel like home? Why she isn't rushing toward romance, craving validation, or chasing someone to complete her? What if her solitude isn't a wound, but a mirror, reflecting everything she had to lose in order to find herself again? We were taught to believe that a woman's value is proven through her connection to others. How wanted she is, how devoted she becomes, how quietly she sacrifices. But what happens when a woman awakens and refuses to be defined by someone else's script? What breaks inside her before she dares to break free? She didn't just walk away from others. She walked toward herself. And that journey was never loud. It wasn't celebrated. No one clapped when she stopped people-pleasing, when she stopped making herself small to fit someone else's comfort. Because the truth is, when a woman reclaims her inner life, the world doesn't always understand. It calls her distant, difficult, or cold. But inside, she's burning brighter than ever before. Only this time, the fire is hers. Is it loneliness she feels? Or is it peace? Is it absence? Or is it finally the presence of her own voice? These are the questions that come when she no longer distracts herself with half-love and borrowed dreams. She's not bitter. She's just unwilling to pour herself into those who drink but never fill. She's not guarded. She's just learned how sacred her energy truly is. In a society addicted to noise, her silence is a revolution. In a culture obsessed with being seen, her invisibility is a choice. So before you assume she's waiting for someone, ask a deeper question. What kind of strength does it take to choose yourself in a world that keeps trying to convince you you're not enough on your own? Maybe she's not running out of time. Maybe she's finally on time with herself. Have you ever wondered why a woman's independence can unsettle people more than her heartbreak ever could? Why does her ability to stand on her own feet shake rooms that once ignored her silence? In a world that teaches women to be agreeable, accommodating, and emotionally available, her self-sufficiency becomes a mirror that reveals everything others try to hide about themselves. And in that reflection, something uncomfortable surfaces. Because when a woman no longer needs a relationship to feel whole, she exposes a secret the world has spent centuries avoiding. She breaks the illusion that fulfillment must come from attachment. She challenges the narrative that a woman finds her identity through someone else, and without raising her voice, without making an announcement, she dissolves the myth that dependency equals love. Her very existence becomes a quiet rebellion. Carl Jung taught that anything we deny or repress becomes part of our shadow. And perhaps that is why so many react strongly to a woman who chooses solitude. Her independence reminds people of the parts of themselves they abandoned, parts that long to be free, authentic, and unapologetically whole. She becomes a symbol of a path many wanted but were too afraid to walk. In her, others see the courage they silenced in themselves. And this is why she triggers such intense responses, not because she is wrong, but because she is rare. She doesn't beg for affection. She chooses connection. She doesn't shrink from approval. She stands in her presence. She does not ask to be rescued. She rescues herself. And that level of self-possession forces everyone around her to confront their own insecurities, their own emotional dependence, their own fear of being alone with themselves. Think about it. How many people stay in relationships not out of love, but out of fear? How many cling to companionship because the silence of self-reflection feels too heavy? How many confuse comfort with connection, routine with devotion? When a woman steps out of that cycle and chooses herself, she becomes a reminder of everything others have avoided examining. Most men do not know what to do with a woman who does not need saving. And many women, conditioned to anchor their worth in relationships, struggle to recognize themselves in the reflection of such quiet power. But her independence is not an accusation. It is an invitation, a living example of what life can become when wholeness replaces desperation, when intention replaces longing, when inner peace becomes the foundation instead of fear. These women are not detached from emotion. They have simply outgrown environments that drain them. They are not rejecting love. They are rejecting the kind of love that asks them to shrink. Their withdrawal is not emptiness. It is preservation. Their silence is not avoidance. It is clarity. And perhaps this is why the world tries to label them, judge them, explain them away. Because in a society where urgency, validation, and dependency are glorified, a woman who belongs to herself becomes a threat to the emotional status quo. She reveals that there is another way to live, a life where nothing is begged for and everything is chosen, where presence replaces approval, where solitude is not a punishment but a sanctuary. So the deeper question becomes this: are we uncomfortable with her, or with the parts of ourselves she awakens? And what might happen if more people listened to the message she carries simply by living her truth? What happens when a woman finally realizes she was never asking for too much, but simply asking the wrong people? What happens when she no longer tolerates a love that wounds her just to prove she can endure it? In a world that often glorifies sacrifice over self-respect, many women have been conditioned to shrink, to silence their intuition, to believe that staying in something that hurts is more virtuous than walking away. But healing changes that. Healing doesn't make her softer in the way people expect. It makes her sharper. Not bitter, but discerning. Not closed, but precise. It's in the depths of her solitude that she remembered herself, not the version of her that was molded by expectations, but the one that existed before she was ever told who she should be. Carl Jung taught that individuation is the process of becoming whole by integrating all parts of ourselves, especially the ones we've disowned. And, for many women, especially those over 35, this process doesn't begin until after the heartbreak, after the betrayal, after the collapse of a love they thought would save them. It begins in the wreckage, in the silence after the storm, when there's no one left to please but the soul staring back at them in the mirror. That's where the real work starts. That's when she stops trying to be chosen and starts choosing herself. What if the loneliness you fear is actually the threshold of your rebirth? What if the ache you feel isn't emptiness, but the clearing away of everything that was never real? Because the truth is, she didn't just heal from pain, she alchemized it. She turned it into boundaries, clarity, and a deep sense of self-worth that no longer needs to be proven to anyone. And this unnerves people. Because a woman who no longer compromises herself is unpredictable. She can't be lured with flattery, guilted into staying, or manipulated by fear. She has met her shadow and made peace with it. And in doing so, she became a mirror to those who haven't. So many ask, but doesn't she get lonely? And the answer is layered. Of course she does. She's human. But the kind of loneliness she experiences is not the one that begs for someone to fill the silence. It's the kind that sharpens her awareness, refines her desires, and keeps her standards sacred. She'd rather be alone than in relationships that dim her light. She's not running from connection, she's making room for the right kind. And maybe that's the hardest lesson of all, learning to love without losing yourself, to stay open without being consumed, to be whole in the presence of another without needing them to complete you. And now I ask you, not just as a listener, but as someone living this life, what part of you are you still abandoning for the illusion of being loved? What truth are you whispering in your soul that the world keeps trying to silence? And when will you finally listen, not to them, but to you? What if the reason so many men find her intimidating isn't that she's too much, but because she sees too much? Because she doesn't just hear words, she feels energy. She doesn't just listen, she senses. In a world that rewards masks and surface-level charm, her depth becomes disruptive. She no longer plays the game of pretending not to notice when someone's actions betray their words. She no longer smiles to keep the peace when her body tightens in warning. And this is what unnerves people, her refusal to abandon her inner knowing just to be liked. She doesn't seek approval anymore, she seeks alignment, and that terrifies those who have built their identities on performance, not presence. In real life, this woman often gets labeled as too intense, too emotional, or too complicated. But those words are just projections from people who are too disconnected from their own emotional landscapes. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." So, when someone is disturbed by her self-trust, her standards, or her solitude, it reveals less about her and more about the parts of themselves they've buried. Her emotional clarity doesn't just highlight their confusion, it confronts it. She's like a mirror they didn't expect to look into, and not everyone is ready to face what's reflected back. This woman has walked through the fires of betrayal, abandonment, and self-doubt, not to become hard, but to become clear. She's done the inner work most avoid: shadow work, boundary work, mirror work. She's not just emotionally intelligent, she's emotionally honest. And honesty is rare. It dismantles illusions. It challenges power games. It asks, "Are you here because you see me, or because you want something from me?" And many cannot answer that truthfully because they've never asked themselves that question. Jung taught that the shadow is not just the dark side we hide, but the unconscious parts of us that get projected onto others. So when someone finds her presence too much, it's often their unprocessed wounds that are reacting, not the reality of who she is. Her boundaries activate people's control issues. Her solitude reveals their dependency. Her peace unsettles their chaos. And her refusal to chase? That exposes how many people are only comfortable in relationships where they feel needed, not truly seen. So ask yourself honestly, why do you think you're drawn to this kind of woman? Is it because you admire her wholeness, or because you secretly hope to be completed by it? Are you ready to meet her where she is, or are you still hoping she'll come down to where you feel safe? Because she won't. She's no longer available for half-love, vague words, or almost healing. She's not looking for someone to fix her, save her, or define her worth. She's already done that work. What she's looking for now is resonance, a soul that has also faced its darkness and come out honest. And maybe the deeper question is this: are you ready to be that honest with yourself? What if the reason she feels so misunderstood isn't that she's doing something wrong, but because she's finally doing something right? In a society built on expectations, templates, and age-old scripts, what happens when a woman tears up the script and writes her own? This isn't rebellion for the sake of being different. It's a revelation. It's a quiet, dignified revolution that begins the moment a woman realizes she was never broken for not fitting into the mold. She was simply misplaced, and instead of shrinking to fit, she chose to expand. But expansion isn't always applauded, especially not when it's emotional, spiritual, or internal. Most people are comfortable with the woman who doubts herself, who second-guesses her worth, who stays silent so others can be loud. But what happens when that woman stops shrinking? When does she stop apologizing? Carl Jung spoke of the individuation process, the journey of becoming one's true self by integrating all the hidden, repressed, and unloved parts. This woman is living that journey. And it's not glamorous. It's not always Instagram-worthy. It's lonely. It's misunderstood. It's terrifying. But it's true. And the truth, unlike appearances, has gravity. You can feel it when she walks into a room. She's not louder, she's deeper, she doesn't demand attention, she radiates self-possession. And that's rare, that's sacred, but sacredness threatens superficiality, so people project. She's bitter, she's cold, she thinks she's better than everyone. But in truth, she's simply not pretending anymore. She's tired of performance, she wants real. And that scares those who haven't yet faced themselves, because when someone stands in their truth, it challenges everyone who is still hiding behind a mask. So, is she alone, or is she aligned? Is she isolating, or finally choosing who gets access to her inner world? In a world that idolizes coupling, have we forgotten the holiness of solitude? Jung believed that loneliness is not the absence of people, but the absence of meaningful connection. And this woman would rather walk alone in truth than crowd herself with noise that drowns her soul. Have you ever considered that what looks like solitude might actually be a sacred cocoon? That perhaps she's not resisting love, but making space for a higher version of it? One not built on need, but on mutual freedom? One that doesn't fill a void, but magnifies an already whole soul? What if the woman you see walking alone isn't lost, but found, not missing something, but returning to herself? In a culture that celebrates being chosen, she celebrates choosing herself. And that's not loneliness, that's liberation. She's not waiting, she's becoming. And maybe that's the deepest kind of power there is, the ability to be enough for yourself, even when the world tells you you're not. So, ask yourself, is your discomfort with her solitude really about her, or about the parts of yourself you've been too afraid to meet in silence? This is not a phase, it's a passage, and she's walking it without shame. What happens when a woman stops asking the world for permission to exist as she is? When she no longer begs for approval, no longer softens her truth to keep the peace, no longer shrinks herself to fit inside someone else's idea of enough? At first, the world calls it defiance, rebellion, coldness. But underneath the surface, something far deeper is unfolding. Something Carl Jung would recognize as individuation, the sacred process of becoming whole by integrating everything we once disowned. And in this woman's life, that means reclaiming the parts of herself she was once taught to hide. For years, she believed her worth was in how easily she made others' lives, how agreeable, how available, how little space she took up. She was trained to apologize for her own instincts, to smile through discomfort, to interpret silence as failure. But one day, she started listening to something older than the voices outside her, something ancient and bone-deep, a knowing that didn't speak in words but in sensations, in nudges, in the aching pull of intuition. And from that day forward, everything began to change. Carl Jung wrote that we all carry within us a shadow, the part of ourselves that contains everything we've repressed, denied, or rejected in order to belong. For women, that shadow is often filled with sacred rage, unmet needs, untold truths, and the raw instinct to protect what is precious. For this woman, choosing herself meant confronting that shadow, not as a threat, but as a guide. It meant sitting in the fire of shame and letting it burn off the lies she inherited. It meant recognizing that people-pleasing wasn't kindness, It was fear, that staying silent wasn't peace, it was self-abandonment. And that love without self-respect is not love, it's captivity dressed as connection. So now she walks through life with a different rhythm. She no longer runs after crumbs of affection or explains her boundaries to those committed to misunderstanding them. She doesn't chase closure from the people who caused the wound. She understands that the wound was the teacher, that the heartbreak was the initiation, that being alone is not a punishment, but a purification. And slowly, she stopped performing for the crowd and started dancing for her own soul. This is the paradox she lives. Her solitude looks empty to those who fear their own company. Her peace looks arrogant to those addicted to noise. Her wholeness feels threatening to those who benefit from her fragmentation. But she doesn't flinch. She knows that the more she honors her truth, the more she becomes a mirror to those still hiding from theirs. So let me ask you, what part of yourself have you been told is too much? What truth have you swallowed just to be loved? And what would happen if you finally said, "No more"? Would you lose approval? Or would you find your soul? Because healing, as Jung teaches us, isn't about becoming lovable in someone else's eyes. It's about becoming someone you can live with when the world is quiet and the mirror is honest. And that is the power of choosing yourself. What if the real reason they fear her isn't her strength, but the fact that she no longer needs their approval to breathe? Society is comfortable with women who doubt themselves, who shrink to fit in, who soften their voice to make others feel strong. But a woman who has faced herself in the mirror of her solitude, who has listened to her own silence long enough to hear the voice beneath the noise, she is no longer breakable. And that terrifies people. Because you cannot control someone who has made peace with being misunderstood. You cannot manipulate someone who no longer chases validation like a lifeline. She is not performing, she is not pleasing, she is simply present. And that kind of presence, raw and unfiltered, is rare in a world addicted to performance. In real life, how often are women taught to dim their clarity so others don't feel threatened? How often are they told to water themselves down, to be approachable, to soften their intelligence, to suppress their standards in the name of being realistic? She lived that way for years, believing that being too much was wrong, that asking for depth made her needy, that being alone meant she had failed at love. But then she realized the problem was never her hunger for meaning. The problem was a world that feeds on emotional scarcity. And when she stopped apologizing for her emotional standards, something profound happened. She stopped confusing attention with affection. She stopped mistaking emotional availability for emotional maturity. Carl Jung reminds us that the journey of individuation demands that we confront the parts of ourselves we were taught to reject. This woman dared to meet the part of herself that had been silenced, the part that wanted more, not from entitlement, but from inner truth. She walked into the forest of her unmet needs and unearthed the truth. She was not too much. She was finally becoming whole. And once you become whole, you stop tolerating being broken just to be accepted. You stop shrinking just to fit into someone else's comfort zone. She realized that a real connection does not demand her silence, it demands her truth. And that truth is her new language. It's the way she says no without guilt. It's the way she chooses her peace over performance. It's the way she walks away not to wound, but to protect what she has rebuilt inside. Now, she is no longer looking for someone to fill a void. She is listening for someone who speaks the language of wholeness. She is not impressed by charm. She is drawn to integrity. She no longer waits to be chosen. She chooses herself every single day. And in doing so, she becomes the woman who inspires both fear and awe. Fear, because you cannot control a woman who has met her shadow and survived. Awe, because in a world of echoes, she has become a voice. Do you know what that kind of voice sounds like? It sounds like peace. It sounds like freedom. It sounds like someone who no longer runs from herself. And maybe that's what we're all secretly longing for, not to be loved for our masks, but to be seen without them. Are you ready to meet yourself the way she has? Or will you keep shrinking to be digestible for a world that's starving for something real? What kind of love finds a woman who no longer needs to be rescued? It is not the love that arrives with fireworks and grand gestures, but the kind that moves like water, quiet, present, and real. After all she's lived through, she no longer desires a love that entertains her loneliness. She wants a love that respects her wholeness. And that kind of love can only enter when the void inside is no longer begging to be filled. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And this woman, who once mistook intensity for intimacy and sacrifice for affection, has made that unconscious conscious. She now sees where she used to abandon herself to be held, and so she no longer calls it love unless it meets her in her center, not in her wounds. This is the moment where real transformation begins, when the woman who once waited by the door now opens the door inward. She no longer asks, "Will he stay?" She asks, "Will I stay with myself if he leaves?" That question rewrites everything. It shifts the gravity of her love life from dependence to resonance. And in that space, she doesn't just date, she discerns. She listens with her body. She watches with her spirit. She feels sick in her entire nervous system. The man who once charmed her with promises now feels transparent. The one who arrives with presence, calm and clear, is the one who gets her attention. And even then, she doesn't lose herself. She doesn't fall in love. She walks alongside it. This woman has become a sanctuary, not a stage. Her love is no longer performative, no longer conditional. It is the natural overflow of a soul that is rooted deep enough to hold herself. She doesn't chase union. She is a union. And that's the secret most people never tell you. That the greatest love is not the one you find, but the one you become. She has become the home she used to seek. And now, the love she attracts doesn't try to possess her. It respects the sacredness of her solitude, the fire of her discernment, and the brilliance of her becoming. So if you're wondering why some women seem to rise after heartbreak, glowing, untouchable, and clear, it's because they no longer love to be chosen. They love to choose. And in that choosing, they reclaim their story. Not as victims, not as abandoned hearts, but as conscious creators of a deeper kind of love. A love that doesn't complete them. A love that meets them. Is that not the kind of love we all secretly long for? One that doesn't ask us to shrink, but invites us to expand. One that begins not in finding the other, but in finally returning to ourselves. If this touched something sacred inside you, don't let it fade into silence. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your presence here is not just support, it's resonance. And if you feel moved to give back, your donation becomes a quiet but powerful gesture that helps keep this light alive for others still walking in the dark.